So this is theme one, value creation. Very important topic, because without value, the process just doesn't show. So we have this first webinar is about creating and sharing value through on-farm experimentation. And really, I thought the best way of introducing would just be to give a personal reflection from myself. Probably the easiest way is to relate to you my quick story as I blundered my way through on-farm experimentation. Really, I started this journey in the 1990s. I think it was 93 or 94, with actually it was a trial of variable rate technology in Australia. I think the first one. This was our first trial area. It was a 72 hectare field. Excuse the old imagery, but that was as good as we had in those days. And we put down our first on-farm experiment, 72 hectare nitrogen trial. And we did this because it was pretty clear to us that whilst we, and when I say we, I mean a CSIRO, Precision Agriculture Research Group, we were trying to explore methods of using precision agriculture. And it was quite clear that at that time, the prevailing models of prescription just weren't working for us very well. So we thought we'd switch towards a process control option, at which we introduced deliberate variation and saw how things went using yield monitoring technology. We learned a lot from that. First of all, we learned it was relatively easy to put out these large experiments. We also learned that farmers had absolutely no problem understanding how to use them. They liked them. But we also learned that actually to get these ideas accepted by agronomists was extremely hard. There just wasn't the science or the research history to actually back them up in a way that people accepted the results. So then I actually left that. I left Australia to join the CG system. And unbeknownst to me, there were efforts going on within the CG at CIMMYT and elsewhere at CIAT to look at farming systems research and participatory research. And these were major efforts to try and work against the idea of top-down research. They were working with farmers and communities to try and develop bottom-up participatory research processes. They did a lot of work helping to organize and learn from farmers and learn with farmers. But so far as I could tell, they had no method of paying for themselves. So I'm not saying they died, but they didn't have an endogenous driving system. And that was quite a useful lesson for me to learn that. I spent some years in the CG and elsewhere, and then went back to Australia, came back to Australia in about 2016, and I found that in actual fact, there were plenty of farmers who were practicing on-farm experimentation here in Australia, but elsewhere. We still had a very strong focus on the data side of things and the analysis, but in actual fact, business cases were forming, although the processes weren't very clearly explained. So we had an emerging business model, if you like, and some of the concepts that we were looking for were also emerging, but it was very incomplete. The process is still quite incomplete, and that's why we need to have these webinars and the conference to actually draw together the large range of disciplinary subjects necessary to make on-farm experimentation really work for us. And this is how we see the process as a whole, overall, what we call the Overtour-Lacoste racetrack. There are various features about this to help explain how we see this going. The first one is that it's farmer-centric. Farmers actually fuel the research process. We prefer working with real systems because that's what farmers are managing, obviously. It is strongly evidence-driven. The insights are anchored in the landscape as managed. Experts are involved, but their experts are enablers. It's still farmer-centric, but experts are needed to enable processes going on. And the process itself is co-learning with an emphasis on engaging by sharing. And the last point there is really quite important. It relates to the point that I made earlier, is that we're looking for processes to socialize the process and to make it scalable so that we can actually generate fully scalable and self-replicating processes going on. So from all of that, I condense these down into 6 so-called principles, fairly broad principles that I think will be reflected again by speakers later on in that. The first is that we must always have a clear value proposition for the process, because without demonstrated value to farmers and others, the process cannot sustain itself. It will always be requiring external sources, and we want to get away from that. Second point is that the source of the value is the knowledge that those processes of on-farm experimentation generate. And from that knowledge, we have the certainty and belief that enables farmers and others to do things better at farm scale, at landscape scale, at the scale at which they manage. The science is very important, and it supports on-farm experimentation through 3 interacting disciplinary fields. And this is perhaps the most difficult part for scientists to work with. Obviously, we have the data sciences, and that's where we started, because unless you have good data and good analysis, you don't get the clarity that farmers want to actually move the process forward. But there are 2 other fields that are extremely important. One of those is social sciences, the economics, psychology, the behavioral sciences that explain how that insight and information coming out of data is actually used and helps to actually make value. And the third area there, which is what I call broadly the agricultural sciences, there is a long-term need for us to improve our understanding of the biology at the scale at which we're seeing these on-farm experimentations. And this is something that we found very difficult to start with, because the agronomy just didn't really explain all of the rich observations that we had. 3 other points that I think are helpful and important. First is that the value is shareable. If you can make the value shareable, then that's something that can be scaled up. Now, value can be acquired by individuals, or it might be acquired by communities. It might also be acquired by others within value chains, such as suppliers or traders. And the other point about this shareable value is that the knowledge acquisition itself can be instantaneous, that is in this year, or it might be part of a long-term cumulative process of knowledge creation and accumulation. The 5th point is that it's important to achieve scaling and growth through arrangements, business models, whatever you call them. These are the things that are really only just emerging. The scaling processes that are going to enable the OFE to scale up to the level at which we want. And the 6th and final point is that whilst we're focusing on OFE is not the only data using process. There are many others. In actual fact, OFE might be embedded within a much broader data-driven process. But we focus on experimentation largely at this point because it's a process of natural inquiry that many farmers already do. And so when we talk to farmers, it's quite easy to get them to explore experimentation, somewhat easier to do that.